Have you ever felt your entire life vanish in the space of a single document? Madison Clark stood just inside the lobby of Titan Axis, the sliding glass doors shutting behind her with a soft, pneumatic hiss that somehow sounded final. Morning sunlight cut through the high windows, scattering across the polished floor in bright white shards. It all looked so pristine, so perfect, like nothing bad could ever happen here. And yet, Madison's badge had flashed red at the security gate for the first time in 14 years. The receptionist, a young woman Madison barely recognized, peered at her with eyes full of rehearsed sympathy. "Hi, Ms. Clark, I'm going to need you to head up to E314. E314. Madison felt that number lodge in her chest like a splinter. There was no E314 on the old office maps she used to study like scripture during all-nighters. She clenched her jaw and moved past the desk, each step echoing too loudly in a hallway, once alive with laughter and arguments about code merges and sprint deadlines. Now it felt like walking through the belly of a sleeping machine, cold, metallic, waiting to devour her. Titan Axis had once been a place of relentless noise and messy brilliance, a converted garage with scuffed concrete floors and cables dangling from the ceiling like jungle vines. The air had smelled of burnt solder and ambition. Madison had coded until her fingers cramped, fueled by Red Bull and half-baked optimism. She'd believed then that she was helping build something permanent. Now, that same company was wrapped in sterile silence, devoured by a corporate giant called Orion Holdings. People liked to call it a merger. Madison knew better. A merger suggested collaboration, equality. Instead, this was a slow digestion. Orion Holdings swallowing Titan Axis cell by cell until nothing was left except the Orion logo on every wall and corporate slogans masquerading as vision statements. As she passed conference rooms, Madison spotted the faces of people she'd once worked beside engineers who used to send her memes during deployments, PMs who'd shared whiskey shots after launch nights. Now they sat behind glass panels, eyes glazed, shoulders stiff. Each desk looked eerily clean, stripped of the clutter that used to tell the story of who they were. No post-its scribbled with half-finished ideas. No mugs crusted with dried coffee. No random gadgets disassembled for curiosity's sake. Madison's stomach twisted as she saw strangers walking the halls in matching Orion Holdings jackets, tapping on tablets like auditors cataloging exhibits in a museum. One man, young and wide-eyed, caught her gaze and quickly looked away. That told her all she needed to know. She reached her former desk, only to find her dual monitors gone, replaced by a lone laptop bearing an Orion Holdings asset sticker. A single envelope sat beside it, printed in all caps, "Integration Packet." She stared at it as though it might bite. Above her, the old Titan Axis mission statement had been scrubbed off the wall. In its place hung an Orion Holdings poster with a pristine navy background that screamed in white letters, "One Orion. One future," Madison whispered under her breath. "One future that doesn't include me." She picked up the envelope with trembling fingers, suddenly aware that her hands were ice cold. Behind her, 2 Orion employees spoke in hushed tones, tossing glances her way. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. Synergies, resource optimization. Madison felt her skin crawl. She wanted to spin around and yell that synergy was just corporate code for layoffs. But she kept moving instead, her eyes fixed on the elevator at the end of the hall. Somewhere deep in her chest, a tiny ember glowed. Anger. Refusal. A voice that whispered, "This isn't over." She reached the elevator and jabbed the button hard enough to hurt. As the doors slid shut around her, she watched her reflection flicker on the stainless steel. She barely recognized herself. Disheveled hair, dark circles under her eyes. a Titan Axis hoodie half-zipped over a rumpled t-shirt. She tightened her grip on the integration packet until the edges crumpled. The intercom crackled above her head. Clinical and indifferent. Madison Clark, please report to E314 immediately. A shiver ran down her spine. She exhaled, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out into a future she'd never asked for, determined that if Orion Holdings wanted to erase her, they were going to have to fight for every inch. The air inside E314 felt like it had been chilled for something far more sinister than a meeting. Madison stepped in, and the door whispered shut behind her with a click that sounded too much like a lock turning. The room was small and sterile, painted the same lifeless gray as an overcast sky. No windows, no personal touches, just a metal table and 3 chairs positioned with surgical precision. 2 people sat waiting on the far side of the table. The man wore a sleek navy suit and carried the kind of posture that suggested his spine was a metal rod. A crisp nameplate in front of him announced him as Daniel Pierce, Senior Vice President of Corporate Realignment. Beside him was a woman in an ivory blouse and pearl earrings, her hair cut into a severe bob that framed a face trained into a professional smile. Her folder lay precisely centered on the table. Madison's name printed in bold black letters on the tab. Daniel rose half an inch, offering a polite nod instead of a handshake. Madison, please, have a seat. Madison eyed the single empty chair opposite them like it might be booby-trapped. She lowered herself into it, folding her arms tight across her chest, fingers digging into her elbows. Daniel spoke first, each word rolling out in the kind of measured, soft tone you'd use with a wild animal you were trying not to spook. First, I'd like to express how deeply we appreciate your contributions to Titan Axis. You've been instrumental in many successful deployments. Madison said nothing. Daniel continued, clearing his throat. However, as you're aware, following the merger with Orion Holdings, we've been working diligently to identify opportunities for operational alignment and resource optimization. Madison felt heat rise up her neck. There it is, she said, her voice cold as steel. The script. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry. The resource optimization script. Madison shot back. You know, the polite way of saying we're cleaning house and you're first on the chopping block. Rebecca, the woman in pearls, jumped in smoothly, her voice as silky as a ribbon but sharp underneath. Madison, my name is Rebecca Klein, HR partner at Orion Holdings. I understand this is a difficult moment, but we want to handle this with transparency and respect. Madison scoffed. Transparency. You're sitting in a room that didn't exist until yesterday. Rebecca hesitated, lips pressing together before she continued. Due to overlapping responsibilities between Titan Axis and Orion's infrastructure teams, your role has been identified as redundant. We're offering you a severance package equivalent to 2 weeks' pay, continued health benefits for 30 days, and an additional discretionary payment of $40,000 in exchange for your signature on a mutual release and non-disparagement agreement. Madison felt her nails dig crescent moons into her skin. 2 weeks, she repeated, voice low. After 14 years, after coding half the damn architecture this company runs on. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Madison, this isn't personal. Don't you dare, she interrupted, slamming her palms onto the table so hard the metal rattled. Don't you dare say it's not personal. You're trying to erase me. You're rewriting history so you don't have to pay the people who built this place. Rebecca leaned forward, softening her voice as though speaking to a child. We're offering a generous transition to help you land on your feet. Madison laughed, short and hollow. You think 40 grand buys my silence? Do you even know what I did here? The systems I designed, the migrations I led. Or am I just another name on your redundancy chart? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech, but realized mid-sentence he'd left the script at home. Rebecca cleared her throat. "We are not disputing your past contributions, Madison, but moving forward, we must consider what's best for the unified organization." Madison leaned back, folding her arms tighter. "And what's best for the unified organization is pretending I never existed." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. A hush fell over the room, heavy enough to feel like it had weight. Daniel eventually slid a thick envelope across the table toward her. "This outlined the severance package and required agreements. We'll need your decision within 5 business days." Madison stared at it, feeling like she was staring at a funeral program. Rebecca spoke again, her voice smoothing over the tension like spackle on a cracked wall. "I assure you, Madison, we're handling this with the utmost dignity." Madison tilted her head, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Funny, it feels a lot more like euthanasia." Rebecca flinched. Madison rose abruptly, chair screeching backward. "You know what? Keep your packet. I'm not signing a damn thing." Rebecca's calm cracked for just a moment. "Madison, please." But Madison was already out the door. As the door closed behind her, the cold air of E314 seemed to cling to her skin like frost. She walked down the corridor, her legs trembling with adrenaline, pulse pounding in her ears. Somewhere deep inside her chest, the ember that had been flickering all morning flared into a steady flame. They wanted to erase her. But Madison wasn't ready to disappear. Rain poured over Seattle like the sky itself was trying to scrub the city clean. Madison burst into her apartment, slamming the door behind her, the echo ricocheting off the walls. Water dripped from her hair, soaking into the worn hardwood beneath her feet. She tossed the integration packet onto the couch as though it might bite her. The silence in the apartment felt suffocating. For a moment, she simply stood there, chest heaving, listening to the rain hammering the windows. Then she pushed her fingers through her damp hair and let out a breath that rattled in her lungs. She stalked into the kitchen, grabbed a half-empty bottle of bourbon from the cabinet, and poured a splash into a chipped coffee mug. She stared into the amber liquid, half expecting it to whisper answers back to her. "This can't be it," she murmured. Her gaze drifted across her living room, the souvenirs of a life built in quiet, determined hours. Framed photos from hackathons, a trophy for best technical achievement at some long-forgotten developer conference, a shelf of thick programming manuals, their spines cracked and fraying. She set the mug down, wiped her palms on her jeans, and crossed to the small closet she jokingly called her adult file cabinet. Bills, insurance paperwork, tax returns she'd meant to shred years ago. She dug deeper, fingers brushing something solid and unfamiliar. When she pulled it out, her breath caught. A leather-bound folio, ox blood red, corners worn smooth with time, embossed across the cover, in gold letters that still caught the light. Seed and Axis Inc., Employment Agreement, Madison Clark. Her pulse skittered. Memories flooded back, sharp as broken glass. Sitting in that Belltown garage a lifetime ago, sweat sticking her hair to her neck, as Oliver King Titan's CTO and co-founder handed her this exact folio. "You're not just an employee," he'd told her, voice fierce, eyes burning. "You're a builder. I wanted your contract to feel real." "Because you are." At the time, she'd rolled her eyes. She'd thought it was corny. Now, as her fingers traced the embossed lettering, she whispered, "Please, let there be something in here." She carried it to the coffee table and sat down hard, flipping it open. The pages smelled faintly of printer ink and dust. Her eyes scanned past the usual clauses: job title, salary, intellectual property rights. Then she saw it, a bold header near the back. Section 12, Change of Control Clause. Her breath caught in her throat. She began to read aloud, her voice shaking. "In the event that Titan Axis Inc. is acquired, merged, or otherwise absorbed by another entity, The employee shall be entitled to accelerated vesting of all outstanding equity interests, including unexercised options, and a performance-equivalent bonus in cash or stock equal to 1.8 times the valuation of such equity as determined at the time of acquisition. Should the employee be terminated without cause within 12 months of said change of control? She blinked, then read it again, each word striking her like a hammer. This clause shall survive any subsequent at-will policy revisions, unless expressly waived by the employee in writing. Her hands began to tremble. Holy hell! She dropped back against the couch cushions, eyes wide, heart slamming against her ribs. The merger, Orion Holdings acquisition, her termination, all within 6 weeks. She flipped through every page in the folio, hunting for anything that might nullify Section 12, a waiver, an amendment, a note in the margins. Nothing. No signature, no document. She'd never waived a damn thing. Madison scrambled for her phone, thumb flying across the screen as she pulled up the SEC filings from the acquisition. She found the number she'd burned into her memory since the merger closed, $68.75 per share. Her mind did the math faster than any calculator. She owned 132,000 shares. Multiply that by 1.8. Over $9 million. She slammed the folio shut and pressed it to her chest, the leather cool against her skin. Tears sprang to her eyes, not of sadness, but of sheer electrified shock. They'd tried to wipe her out with a severance check. But they'd missed this clause. This clause was her sword and shield. She glanced at the integration packet still lying on the couch, untouched. Madison wiped her eyes, jaw hardening. She whispered into the empty room. They thought I'd go quietly. They thought wrong. Outside, thunder cracked like a warning shot. Madison reached for her phone again. Her fingers hovered over her contacts, then settled on one name, Felicia Grant. It was time to fight. The lobby of Grant & Foster LLP smelled faintly of rain-soaked coats and the paper dust of endless legal battles. Madison stood just inside the revolving doors, clutching the oxblood folio so hard her knuckles were white. Above her, the firm's name glowed in silver letters across a dark marble wall. It looked imposing, like the gateway to a place where decisions were made that could tilt entire lives. She blew out a shaky breath and forced herself toward the reception desk. Madison Clark, I have an appointment with Felicia Grant. The receptionist, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper manicure, barely looked up. 16th floor. Go ahead. The elevator ride felt eternal. Madison stared at her reflection in the brushed metal walls, noticing for the first time just how tired she looked. But there was something else in her eyes now. A spark. Felicia Grant's office door was half open when Madison arrived. Inside, Felicia was mid-argument on the phone, pacing behind her desk, voice smooth and lethal. No. Listen carefully. If your client's next email even hints at for cause, I'll file for retaliation so fast their board will need oxygen masks. She clicked the call off and turned, eyes locking onto Madison with a fierce kind of welcome. Sit. Madison obeyed, lowering herself into the chair opposite the massive oak desk, setting the folio on top as though laying a weapon down between them. Felicia's gaze dropped to the leather cover. Her lips curled into a hint of a grin. Tell me everything. Madison spoke in a rush. The failed badge scan. The cold little room called E314. Daniel and Rebecca offering her 2 weeks of pay and a hush clause. The manila envelope. And then she slid the folio closer. Felicia flipped it open, scanning with eyes that seemed to devour every word. The room was silent except for the distant patter of rain against the windows. After a full minute, Felicia let out a low whistle. Oh, my God. Madison swallowed. It's real. Right? They can't just pretend it doesn't exist. Felicia jabbed her finger at the page. This clause is more than real. It's dynamite. And from the looks of it, nobody at Orion Holdings bothered to read it. She read aloud, voice crisp and rising with excitement. This clause shall survive any subsequent at-will policy revisions, unless expressly waived by the employee in writing. She snapped the folio shut. Did you ever sign anything waiving this clause? Madison shook her head. Never. No one even mentioned it until now. Felicia leaned forward, eyes blazing. Then guess what? Madison Orion Holdings owes you? Big time. Madison exhaled shakily. How big are we talking? Felicia grabbed a yellow legal pad and did rapid calculations. Numbers scrawling across the page. Acquisition closed at $68.75 a share. Multiply your 132,000 shares by 1.8. Subtract any already vested portions. Madison, that's over $9 million. Before interest. Madison felt her pulse rocket through her chest. $9 million. Felicia slapped the pen down, leaning back in her chair with a grin sharp enough to cut glass. They fired you, tried to bury you in a 2-week severance check, and in doing so, they triggered this clause. They basically handed you a loaded gun. Madison swallowed, voice trembling. But they're threatening me, calling me unstable, saying I took proprietary data. What if they go nuclear? Felicia's eyes glinted. Let them. They'd have led with evidence if they had any. They're bluffing. This clause is a contractually binding promise, and their failure to acknowledge it puts them in breach. She lifted a hand and ticked off points on her fingers. Number 1, we draft a demand letter to Orion's general counsel, the CEO, the board. Number 2, we outline exactly what they owe you to the penny. Number 3, we give them 14 business days to pay, or we file suit in federal court for breach of contract and bad faith. Felicia paused, smile wicked. And number 4, we make it crystal clear that if they try to tarnish your reputation, we'll make it public. Every last detail. Madison's throat went dry. But the backlash, the press. Felicia waved it off. Orion Holdings wants one thing above all silence. They'll move heaven and earth to keep this out of the headlines. The phrase shareholder lawsuit gives their board nightmares. We're not just fighting for your money. Madison, we're fighting for the truth of who you are. And you are not redundant. Madison sat there, heart pounding, words fighting to escape her lips. Finally, she found her voice. I don't want them to just pay me off. I want them to remember my name every time they talk about mergers and synergies. I want them to know they didn't erase me. Felicia's grin widened into something fierce and bright. Good, because I don't do hush money. I do justice. She reached across the desk and tapped the folio gently. Let's remind Orion Holdings exactly who the hell they're dealing with. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of rain and electric possibility. Madison stood, squared her shoulders, and held out her hand. Let's do this! Felicia clasped it firmly, voice steady as a judge's gavel. Welcome to war. Madison stood on her balcony as dawn cracked over the Seattle skyline, cold wind biting her cheeks. The city below pulsed with life cars crawling through slick streets, neon signs blinking like coded messages. She wrapped her hoodie tighter around herself, phone clutched in her fist like a weapon. Felicia's words still echoed in her mind. Welcome to war. By the time Madison stepped back inside, her phone was vibrating nonstop. Emails, calls, notifications piling up faster than she could read them. She dropped onto her couch, opened her laptop, and found her inbox swamped with subject lines that made her stomach twist. Immediate discussion required. Urgent contract inquiry. Cease and desist notice. She clicked one open. Ms. Clark. We have reason to believe you may have accessed and retained confidential proprietary data belonging to Orion Holdings and/or Titan Axis. If substantiated, Such actions may constitute willful misconduct, resulting in termination for cause and forfeiture of any contractual claims you believe you possess. Please confirm that you will cease all communication regarding this matter and return all company property immediately. Regards, Kara Hall, Senior Corporate Counsel, Orion Holdings. Madison let out a humorless laugh. They think I'm afraid of letters. She forwarded it straight to Felicia with the single note. Your move, Felicia responded 3 minutes later. Let them try. Drafting our reply. Hold tight. Madison's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Against her better judgment. She answered. Madison Clark. A man's voice spilled through the line, smooth, controlled, and entirely fake. Madison, it's Craig Edgerton, Executive Vice President of Strategic Risk and Compliance at Orion Holdings. Listen, I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here. Madison gritted her teeth. Craig, are you calling to offer me another hush payment? Craig's laugh was soft and insincere. I'm calling because I'd like to avoid litigation. No one wants this to become public. It's costly for everyone. Madison cut him off. Craig, do you even know what's in my contract? A pause. I understand there may be a clause. Don't pretend to understand. Craig cleared his throat, scrambling. Look, we're prepared to offer you $200,000 as a sign of good faith, and assuming you're willing to sign a complete release of claims. Madison stared at the ceiling, exhaling through her nose. $200,000, Craig. That's couch change for your board. My clause is worth over $9 million. You're insulting me with this. Craig's voice grew brittle. I'm trying to help you avoid a situation where this gets messy. Litigation's ugly. People dig into your personal life. Are you sure you want that spotlight? Madison's voice dropped to a cold whisper. Craig, I'm not scared of the light. She hung up. An hour later, Madison sat across Felicia in the lawyer's office. Felicia reading a printed draft aloud. To the Board of Directors and Legal Counsel of Orion Holdings. This correspondence serves as formal notice that Madison Clark is invoking Section 12 of her original Titan Axis employment contract. Madison Clark was terminated without cause within 6 weeks of the acquisition, thereby entitling her to accelerated vesting and a performance bonus calculated at 1.8 times the acquisition price. The total amount due is $9,850.64. Failure to remit payment within 14 business days will result in immediate legal action for breach of contract, bad faith negotiations, and reputational damages. Felicia's eyes flicked up, razor sharp. Ready to send? Madison hesitated, only for a breath. Hit them. Felicia clicked send. By evening, Orion's legal team hit back fast. Madison opened a new email, her chest tightening as she read, Ms. Clark. We categorically reject your claims. Additionally, we reserve all rights to pursue counterclaims based on recent evidence suggesting you may have misappropriated sensitive internal documents prior to your termination. Please be advised that your conduct is under review. Madison blinked, fury blazing up her spine. They're going to try and smear me. Felicia smirked, folding her arms. Of course they are. That's how corporate giants fight. They throw mud until you're too tired or scared to keep going. But they've got nothing. Or they'd have filed suit already instead of sending threats. And besides, the press loves a David versus Goliath story. Madison swallowed hard. I'm not going to let them paint me as crazy or criminal. I built half of what they're using right now. I'm not letting them erase that. Felicia leaned forward, voice low and fierce. Then keep your head up. Madison, the contract is on your side. The numbers are on your side. And if they keep pushing, the court of public opinion will be too late that night. Madison sat alone in her apartment, staring at the city lights dancing on the rain-slick streets. Her phone buzzed with another text from a former coworker. Orion Legal just called me. They asked if you'd ever been emotionally unstable. I told them you were the smartest person in the building. She felt tears prick her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Let Orion Holdings threaten, bluff, and scheme. Madison wasn't going anywhere. She picked up the leather folio, running her fingers across the gold letters once more. They wanted me invisible, she murmured. But I'm the thing they can't unsee. Outside, thunder rolled across the sound, a distant promise that the real storm had only just begun. Madison stared at her laptop screen, the glow painting her face in pale blue. Rain trickled down the windows behind her, each drop tapping out a nervous rhythm that matched the pounding of her pulse. An email popped up on the corner of her screen. Subject: Urgent request to connect. Craig Edgerton. She rolled her eyes so hard it hurt. She'd been ignoring Craig's calls for days, letting them pile up in her voicemail like junk mail she refused to open. But today, she felt something different in her chest, a sharp, almost gleeful calm. She clicked open the email, scanning the familiar corporate fluff. Madison, I hope you're doing well. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss potential resolution options that could benefit both sides. We're willing to explore creative solutions to avoid further escalation. Best, Craig. She slammed her laptop shut so hard the coffee cup on her table rattled. A second later, her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring until it nearly went silent, then answered, Madison Clark. Craig's voice oozed through the line. Madison, I'm glad we could connect. I feel like we're just missing each other lately. Madison said nothing. Craig kept going, a salesman trying to keep the pitch alive. Look, I get it. Emotions are high. Things have been said, but we're prepared to increase our offer. Substantially. Madison's voice was icy calm. How much is substantially, Eat Craigie? Craig hesitated, then delivered the number like he was dropping a gift from heaven. $200,000. In addition to your severance, all contingent on a comprehensive release and confidentiality agreement, of course. Madison laughed, a deep, cutting laugh that startled even her. That's your idea of substantial, Craig. That's not even 3% of what you owe me. It's an insult wrapped in a decimal point. Madison. Craig tried, voice tight. Litigation is expensive, public, messy. Nobody wants that. You could end up with less than nothing when the dust settles. She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a deadly whisper. I'd rather have nothing than let you bury me in silence. You came for the wrong person. Craig stammered. Let's take a step back here. I'm sure we can find a middle ground. Craig, she interrupted, voice slicing through his words like a scalpel. My lawyer's name is Felicia Grant. Call her, and don't ever call me again. She hung up, finger pressing the red button with finality. She dropped the phone on the table and exhaled so hard it felt like she'd been holding her breath for a month. Not 5 minutes later, an alert popped up on her laptop. Subject: Immediate legal action threatened. She clicked it open, heart steady now. The fear that once coiled around her chest burned away. Mtau Clark. Orion Holdings has reviewed your demands and finds them without merit. Further, we have reason to believe you may have removed proprietary information, which constitutes misconduct. Be advised we will pursue all remedies available under law should you proceed. Madison leaned back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. Here we go. She forwarded the email to Felicia with the simple subject line, Your turn. An hour later, Felicia called. They're bluffing. All noise. If they had proof you did anything wrong, they'd be in court right now waving emotion in the air. Instead, they're trying to scare you into folding. Madison ran her fingers through her hair. Frustration simmering. They're going to keep sending this crap. Keep trying to paint me as unstable, disloyal, as some kind of rogue employee. Felicia's voice turned steel hard. And that's when we hit back. I'm filing a formal demand letter to the entire board. I'm CCing their outside counsel. And I'm sending a courtesy copy to a journalist friend at the Wall Street Journal. Not for publication yet, just as a little nudge, so Orion knows this won't stay hidden if they push you any further. Madison felt her pulse spike. You're really going to do that? Madison, Felicia said, with cool certainty. The fastest way to get a corporate giant to pay up is to show them how bad it'll look in the headlines. This isn't just a money fight anymore. This is about reputation. And you're holding the detonator. A wild, sharp laugh bubbled out of Madison's chest. They thought I'd slink away for 40 grand. Felicia's voice dropped low. And instead, they handed you the script for their worst nightmare. That night, Madison stared out her rain-smeared window, city lights bleeding into streaks of gold and red. She remembered every hour she'd poured into Titan Axis, every line of code, every late-night pizza run, every dream that felt like it had burned to ash when Orion Holdings swallowed them whole. She whispered into the darkness, voice steady and sure. They thought I was a line item they could delete. But I'm the story they can't shut down. Outside, thunder rolled across the sound, as though the sky itself was applauding the woman who refused to vanish. The rain had finally stopped, leaving Seattle scrubbed clean under a cold, cloudless sky. Sunlight glinted off glass towers, turning downtown into a jagged city of mirrors. Madison sat cross-legged on her living room floor, the oxblood folio open in front of her. Rays of light spilling across the gold lettering. Her laptop pinged with an incoming call. Felicia's name filled the screen. Madison swallowed once and answered. Felicia appeared, hair slightly rumpled, as if she'd been up all night sharpening legal knives. But she was smiling a real wide grin that split her face like sunshine through storm clouds. It's done. Madison blinked. Felicia leaned closer to the webcam, her voice dropping low. Orion folded completely. They're wiring the full amount today. Madison stared at her, stunned into silence. All of it, she croaked. Felicia nodded, practically vibrating with restrained glee. Every penny. Madison, $9,812,550.64, plus interest. No NDAs, no hush clauses, no for cause excuses. A clean payout. Madison pressed her hand to her mouth, feeling her pulse hammer against her palm. Felicia's eyes softened. I told you, corporations are brave until someone calls their bluff. They'd rather pay you than see Orion Holdings screws over engineer in the Wall Street Journal. Madison let out a short, incredulous laugh. Jesus Christ, $9 million. Felicia raised an eyebrow. After taxes. Don't get too excited. But yeah, it's real. And one more thing. Daniel Pierce. The guy who tried to sell you on Synergy, he's been terminated effective immediately. Board scapegoat. They're blaming him for not flagging your clause during due diligence. Madison blinked, then let her head fall back against the couch. A hysterical laugh bubbling up in her chest. I almost feel sorry for him. Felicia snorted. Don't. He's getting his own severance package. Meanwhile, your name is being whispered like urban legend across every legal department from here to New York. You're the woman who cracked the giant open from the inside. Madison's laughter died down, replaced by a heavy, quiet calm. Felicia, I don't even know what to do with myself now. Felicia tilted her head, her grin turning gentle. Do whatever the hell you want. Sleep for a week? Buy an island. Hell. Just go get the best coffee in Seattle and sit there like a queen. You earned this. Madison, you fought back. Madison blinked rapidly, swallowing against the swell of emotion rising in her chest. I thought they'd erase me. I thought I'd just vanish. Felicia leaned closer to the screen, her voice soft but unyielding. You didn't vanish. You carved your name into their books in letters they'll never be able to erase. You're not redundant. You're the fuse that blew up their comfort zone. The call ended a minute later. Madison sat there in silence, staring at the leather folio. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the worn edges. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders felt light, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally slid off her back. She glanced at her bank app on her phone. A new balance stared back at her, a string of numbers that didn't look real. 9 12, 550, 64. She exhaled a shaky breath. No fanfare, no fireworks, just numbers on a screen. But they were hers. Outside, the sky was blazing blue. Madison stood stretched and walked to the window. She stared out over Seattle, remembering late nights in the Belltown garage, cables snaking across concrete floors, Oliver King shouting about building the future or getting run over by it. She smiled softly. "I built the future," she murmured, "and this time, I didn't get run over." A ping on her phone drew her back. A text from Jerome, her old coworker. "Heard the news. You're a damn legend. Drinks on me anytime. P.S. Daniel's out." "People are cheering," Madison laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Legend, not redundant." She typed back. "Thanks, Jerome. I might just take you up on that." She powered off her phone and let the quiet wrap around her. She thought about the countless nights she'd believed she was disposable. How easy it had been for people like Daniel to smile and tell her it was just business. How close she'd come to signing that paper and walking away in silence. But she hadn't. Because deep down, Madison had known she was worth more than anyone wanted to admit. And now, so did Orion Holdings. She closed the folio, stood up straighter, and whispered into the empty room. "They thought they'd written my ending. Turns out, I'm the one holding the pen." Madison sat curled into the corner of her couch, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, striping her face with gold and shadow. The city outside hummed with quiet purpose, cars whisking over wet streets, neon signs flickering to life one by one. She held the oxblood folio in her lap, running her fingers over the faded gold lettering, feeling each ridge and groove as though the leather were alive. She thought about how close she'd come to letting them erase her, about how many nights she'd stared at her ceiling, convinced she'd become nothing more than a line item labeled redundant. And she realized that the biggest lesson wasn't about contracts or stock options. It was about remembering that no matter how small they tried to make you feel, your story is yours alone to finish. She whispered into the stillness, testing the words like a secret spell. Never sign away your past without reading the fine print, because buried in the fine print might be the very thing that saves you. She remembered every time someone at Orion had told her it was just business, every polite smile masking the blade hidden underneath. And she knew now that just business was too often an excuse for cruelty. She exhaled slowly. Contracts outlive people, and sometimes save them. She thought of Felicia, her fierce grin, her voice sharp enough to cut through corporate lies. She thought of Jerome, still hanging on inside Titan Axis, sending her quiet texts of solidarity. And Madison knew one truth deeper than anything else. Silence can be powerful, but speaking up is even more powerful. Because silence keeps secrets buried, and speaking up drags them into the light, where giants can't hide behind shiny posters and buzzwords. She looked around her small apartment walls, lined with old conference lanyards, books with cracked spines, the battered Titan Axis hoodie draped over a chair. All reminders that the things you build, the things you pour yourself into, they matter. Even if someone else tries to tell you they don't. She smiled, small but fierce. If you've ever felt invisible or erased, remember this. Your story isn't over until you decide it is. You're not just a name on someone else's spreadsheet. You're the fine print they never expected to have teeth. Outside, the sun slipped lower, casting the city in molten gold. Madison closed the folio and set it carefully on the coffee table. She leaned back into the couch, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders, and let the silence settle around her like a soft blanket. They'd tried to erase her. Instead, she'd carved her name into the story, in letters they'd never forget.